First, I told him I'd give him $5,000 if he was willing to grow his hair out for a whole year.
You wouldn't do it for a whole year.
He would not do it for $5,000.
Really?
And I was.
What's the price?
I was dead serious, bro. I was dead serious. Like, grow your hair out for a whole year.
Because you want to see the Martin Luther?
Oh, I wanted to see a whole year's worth of hair on this dude's head and take picture after picture after picture. Because this would be the gift that would give on for the next X number of years, forever.
So what's the number? Just start a GoFundMe.
I would probably do it for like 25.
25.
Yeah, it's stupid.
Yeah.
It's like, yo, you want to do it for
That's far out of reach.
a legit $5,000? Like, you grow your hair out for 12 months, and at the end of it, I give you a check for $5,000.
It's just that, we're at that point in life from $5,000, not really worth it. Like, the things I'm saving for are going to cost
He ain't
a
never
lot more than
been
that.
broke.
He ain't never been broke.
Welcome back to the move. We're vibing for the book
Yeah.
at least 10 minutes at a time. Next 10 minutes, we're looking at Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 to 22.
Wait, hold on. Are we on?
Yeah, we're on. Or 15 to 28, or whatever. We're going through the rest of Hebrews. I'm keeping that in because that was dope.
Oh, shoot.
On that subject of hair,
Yeah.
we have not acknowledged.
Yeah, you cut your hair.
Yeah. I figured because this episode's airing after Internet Church, which if you're not on Internet Church yet,
What are you doing?
You're playing yourself. You're missing out on best gathering every fortnight. I learned that from the Australians.
Yeah, every fortnight.
It's a really helpful word.
Yeah,
you know
every
what the
2
word
weeks.
fortnight? Every 2 weeks. Because bi-weekly could be twice a week or every other week.
Fortnight, yeah.
So join Internet Church.
So, Internet Church, we're studying Hebrews like we're looking at right now, Hebrews chapter 9. And we have been going deep on Hebrews chapter 9 because having the difference between it being Day of Atonement language versus inauguration language has really been clarifying, right? You were just talking about this off camera.
Yeah, just a very weird conclusion. Because at least, maybe this is for context, for those who have been part of the same faith community as the three of us, like one of the conclusions that we have often heard from reading this chapter is like, oh, there's another room in heaven. And I remember hanging out with Matt Whitman from the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and he's like, dude, you additiveness, love you guys, really cool. Just sounds like you invented another room in heaven. And he was like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, okay, cool, whatever. But in the sense, like, if that's the conclusion of the text, like, I kind of get the criticism because that's not the point. It's not that he's just moving from one room to the next. It's that he's doing a new thing. He's inaugurating a new reality.
Yeah, and in that inauguration, phrase that Tyler and I rehearse all the time, there is now a distinction or a clarity, I think, for me, to understand what justification truly is.
Oh.
So he was raised for our justification, right? So that justification is not merely the forensic double imputation of sin and righteousness. So I give him my sin, he gives me his righteousness, so that it is a legal process that is accounted in heaven alien from me, right? That justification, more fully, I think, understood, is, and this I borrowed from a YouTube guy, Cobain the Christian. I think now it goes by Seraphim Hamilton, which is really helpful. Just has a lot of dope stuff. But that, I think it was from him, that justification is the ontological transformation of the human person by union with God through Christ. So that in the inauguration of Hebrews chapter 9, there is the evidence of the transformation in the human person. Who's the human person? Jesus, by union with God. Who's united with God? The human person. But who's the human person? Jesus. How's he united with God? Plot twist, he unites humanity with God in himself because he is God and is man. So he was raised for our justification, meaning that now we actually have a body in heaven that is ontologically transformed. It is materially different, right? And it has united God to man in his body and person. And that reality has been inaugurated. And that reality is spoken of as a most holy place reality, a sanctuary reality, because God and man are united in a way that can never be undone.
You were in Internet Church I'm actually in the process of editing through the sermon that would have aired a couple days ago if you're watching this episode.
Yeah.
The way that timelines work.
Yeah.
You use the language of like, there's Justin, there's Emily, there's an intimacy that happens. Now there's a union of our two beings in the person of Mateo, our child.
Yeah.
And Mateo cannot be from himself. Like
Yeah.
he cannot be separate. Like you cannot undo the
Yeah.
unification that Mateo's body testifies to.
Yeah. Yeah. We are all testaments of our parents' intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Every single human on earth is evidence of their parents' intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Mateo is. He's an evidence of your intimacy. And better yet, because of your guys' commitment and actual free will choice in love, in marriage faithfulness, Mateo is not only a evidence of your intimacy, but he's also evidence of your covenant love. Right? As long as he's alive, you guys are related. This is actually one of the moves that it shifted for my wife. My wife has a heart for adoption, and we've talked about it maybe, right? But I also have a desire for biological children. And one of the things I said to her, and this was in passing, just talking, I was like, you know that the only way we're actually related, the way we'll be related is through our child. Like we're actually family. Like me and my sister, we're biologically, genetically related because we both come from the same source. But you and I, different places, will be related in the child that we have because our child is our intimacy.
Wow.
And she was like, huh? And then she told me later that it's like, that really moved me to want to have a biological child because I love you and I want to be related to you like this, right? This is what God has given us in Jesus, and this is what Jesus has done. He's related to us. He's not ashamed to call us brothers because in his body, he has taken humanity. He's still God, right? He's not a new thing, right?
Are you going to tie in 1 John 5? We going to talk about that?
No, you can tie it
And the
in.
inauguration?
Oh, sure. You
Explain how that's an inauguration thing so that I can tie it in what you just said.
I don't know. You're so
Oh,
much
1
pressure.
John 5.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm wilting! I'm wilting!
Jonathan's not used to the very pointed question. I try to ask questions with enough room for him to take it anywhere.
I was like, huh? Oh, I don't, because my brain was
talk about chapter 5 in this one thing.
Yeah. I'm doing the Richard thing right now, where I'm like, I'm on this trajectory. I got to finish this, right? And now you're to do like, ah.
Yeah.
You do it, yeah. Help us.
Well, first time you were talking earlier off camera about this whole thing that we're talking about, this inaugural thing that Jesus is doing, the unification of God with man in his person as their mediator.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that 1 John 5 actually also shares this language
yeah.
of sanctuary inauguration.
Yeah, where you have these three testify, the water, the blood, and the spirit, right? Where you see this in Hebrews 9, right? Verse 18, therefore not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. So like the first covenant is Moses, the people. He receives the law through God. Then he sprinkles blood on them, and he sprinkles blood on all the instrumentation and all of the furniture in the sanctuary, right? Verse 19, for when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. So you see there's water, there's blood, right? But once there's water, there's blood, then the Shekinah glory actually comes because the fire of God is in their midst and it dwells in the covenant. Well, you see the same thing in 1 John 5, right? Like the water and blood that come out of the side of Jesus, right? Which is highly symbolic back to this. But then the fire of Shekinah glory that comes down at Pentecost, which now all of these things testify, the water, the blood, and the fire, which is all a callback to this
Inaugural moment.
Yeah, this inaugural moment and this unveiling of a new reality. So again, it's not merely the completion of atonement so that Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, having done this forensic work that then the ledger gets moved where we get transferred from guilty to acquitted. Like we can affirm all of that. We can affirm that language, but there's more because sin has been condemned in the person of Jesus and this reality is inaugurated. Go ahead, Tyler.
So we were talking about just like your wife, your kid, and this inaugural thing and the body and all of these things. And I remember one of the first revelations when all of a sudden I got this new lens. I started reading scripture. For some reason, I was in 1 John 5 and I read this and I was like, this is a way that the female body actually bears the image of God in a way that mine can't. Because how does she give birth to a new body? It's through water and blood.
That's so good. And then it takes the breath, and it's
Spirit.
Yeah, spirit.
So literally, I mean, we look around in this life. Every single human being was like life and love and it's just everything is all intertwined in the human, like made in the image of God is made from love, a moment of beautiful intimacy between a man and his wife. That actually from love comes life. And how does that life come? From this like literally sanctuary imagery that God gave. He gave first in the body of Eve.
That's so dope. And she's the mother of all the living. And what's so dope is that now you're saying that, it makes me think about the language that Genesis uses in Hebrew to talk about man and woman, that man is created, right? In some way he's constructed.
That's right.
But the woman is
Formed.
architectured and formed in that sanctuary language. The actual way that she's architectured is the way that
a masterpiece.
Yeah, is the way that the text is going to speak about the sanctuary. It's super dope. That's dope. Yeah, man. So again, Hebrews 9, one of the places of Hebrews 9 that's actually worth mentioning is verse 21 and 22. And in the same way, he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship, right? Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And here, too often people think that the shedding of blood is absolute requirement for the forgiveness of sins, right?
That's like my Bible. I have it written in here. This feels like penal substitutionary atonement. And then I crossed it out and said, JK.
Just kidding, right? And it plays well in the penal substitutionary atonement, where you have this paradigm of retributive justice, where the wrath of God is only satisfied once he distributes back to unholiness that which has been distributed to him.
Like a parent who can only forgive their child after 10 spankings.
Yeah, like so there has to be it's a market economy, so that there's a going rate for forgiveness.
And steal the cookie from the cookie jar, 10 spankings.
Yeah, so it's a market transaction, and the going rate is blood, right?
Because you sin, you die.
Yeah, as opposed to, instead of it being prescriptive, it's descriptive of what would in fact happen, right? That God would shed his blood in order to demonstrate the forgiveness that was always in his heart. So that forgiveness did not require blood as much as forgiveness
is described as
as this
presenting blood,
right? And so it's worth noting that Jesus' death testifies to this, that freedom from powers and principalities and from death and from the fear of death, Hebrews chapter 2, is actually fulfilled in his death, right? Which has blood in it. But it is not catalyzed, or it is not initiated because of his death. His death is a function because it was initiated in the heart of God, because this is who God is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that God is not some God that's like needs blood satisfaction.
Right.
As much as God is the God that saw that this was the only way that it was going to happen.
In one of the Instagram posts I did recently, I was talking about how God forgave you before you asked, which is just factually true, because the cross happened thousands of years before I ever came into existence. And one of these individuals offered up this idea but there is no forgiveness of sin without the remission of blood. And it's just an interesting thing to try and reconcile that with like the most elementary of all Bible verses, that God loves the world, and because of love, he's motivated to send. How does that simultaneously exist if he's still holding on the grudge, if he still hates you, and it's only through, like, it's just interesting how those two ideas can exist in the same person.
Well, yeah, it's great, because, I mean, what you're highlighting is that we think around a whole network of ideas that we might not be conscious of
how they interplay.
So one of the ideas that we think of is that then forgiveness is a transaction. Like, forgiveness requires a transaction that then yields an effect, right? So it's market driven. It's a market transaction. And so again, this whole asking for forgiveness thing, that's always so at the heart. Like, I asked for forgiveness, then because I asked, he gives it.
It's a method.
It's a transaction. And once I ask, he has to give it, because he's faithful and just, right? 1 John 1:9. Except that it's about confessing sin in order to receive his forgiveness. So that forgiveness is not so much a transaction as it is an offer. And you can forgiveness isn't so much asked for as it is received. But if we have this idea of a merely forensic justification, merely forensic that is just legal, then some transaction has to occur in order to have it. And the way it actually plays out in my life once I sin is that now this minor, like justification or sanctification is it's like the buildup of all of these minor transactions. Because when I sin, I ask for forgiveness. And since I ask, then he gives me a little bit of his righteousness that grows me until I fall into that next sin that I ask for forgiveness for. Then he forgives me and then gives me more power and grace to overcome that little sin until I encounter the next big sin that I fall into. But I ask for forgiveness. Then he gives me a little bit of his righteousness and I continue to grow so I don't fall into that sin anymore until I hit the next sin, the next level. And it's always leveling up on the basis of all of these little minor transactions of asking forgiveness, right? As opposed to the language of inauguration, that this new reality is inaugurated. Jesus is your forgiveness. Why? Because he is the removal of sin from humanity in his person, so that now you live in the reality of forgiveness because that's what he is. And then we have the privilege of confessing sin, like we see sin for what it is because his life, death, and now his life as light shines. And we're like, oh, I want no part in that. I renounce it. And when I renounce it, I'm literally repenting. Like the content of repentance is the turn, right? So I'm literally turning from the deceitfulness of sin. And what am I turning towards? I'm turning towards this inaugurated reality that he has inaugurated once and for all. And I'm receiving the benefit of that over my life because it actually is. So we remove ourselves from a market transaction paradigm to a new age paradigm. And I mean that it's an inaugurated new age, not in the new age, like, not that thing.
Is that what new age is?
You tracking with me?
The new reality.
Yeah. So heaven, like this verse here is so dope for me. Thus it was necessary, this is verse 23, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. How is heaven purified?
Yeah, because you would think, at least according to the timeline, heaven was purified a long time ago when Satan and the angels were kicked out.
Yeah, because you threw out the defilement.
Sure.
Right? Well, how is heaven purified? By the presence of God within it.
Purity is not so much the absence of something as much as it's the presence of another thing.
Yeah. Right?
How do you relate to purity, as Braden Louis would like to ask his friends and his coworkers?
Right? How do you relate to purity?
Yeah.
That's so dope. Because think about this. Like, heaven is purified in some meaningful way. I hope I'm still on. I didn't touch it. Heaven is purified in some meaningful way by the presence of this new mode of being that Jesus has secured. Right? So without the presence of Jesus in the mode of new humanity who has secured eternal redemption, heaven is not purified. Why? Because the question still lingers. How good is God? Right? If the question at the heart of the great rebellion in heaven was that the arch enemy, Lucifer, questioned the goodness of God and started his rebellious streak and has now, he's found an outpost for his rebellion to unfold on earth. The question is still, how good is God, right? Especially if in the Old Testament you attribute killings and murders to God. Right. That's a whole other conversation. The question still lingers, how good is God? Then if you have this angry God at the cross who is just pouring down wrath on sinners to actually satisfy his vengeance, how good is God? But when Jesus shows up in the form of a human and he says, I've attached myself to humanity for all time to secure their redemption, because it is not, it's not a thing to me to actually grasp to my eternal power. This is the heart of my eternal power, that I'm willing to become this for the sake of those that I love, and I'm willing to endure death. So that when he emerges into heaven, he is the purification of heaven, because the character and heart of God has been correctly seen because he is.
It's kind of wild. Like when we think of this world, whether it's because of the Christian worldview or the naturalistic worldview, there's such an aversion to the idea of other celestial beings, other kind of alien beings out there. And so the idea of like Jesus becoming like human, it's like, well, duh, what else is he going to be? But like when you think about the grand scheme of creation at large, there's a trillion other types of beings out there, presumably, that he could have, but we are the ones that rebelled. And so the decision to be embodied as a human, not just for a moment, but for all time,
eternity.
When there's seraphims, there's cherubims, there's all kinds of other things that he could have related to.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these other ones presumably haven't fallen. We're the one sheep that goes astray. And he's like, that's the one I'm going to be embodied by.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one I'm going to unify myself to. That's the body that I'm going to inhabit for all time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
what?
Holy crap. Like, that's incredible.
So then this is where the purification, the source of purification, he is the eternal source, right? This is back in Hebrews, 2, 3, right? Like where he is now the eternal source that actually gives purification, right? And what you now have here is that the purifying power of his life is given to us. And for us that receive the Holy Spirit, we are purified and we remain purified and we continue to grow in our purification through the power of the indwelling Spirit. And the way he's actually taking back earth, he is the king of the universe. No doubt about it. But the way he's actually taking back earth from the enemy is by one purified body at a time through the gospel. So as the gospel is being declared, people are being turned from darkness to light. Boop. Now turn and do it for somebody else. And that's how this gospel is going, right? This beautiful language, Hebrews 9, you could see it in that song of
King of Kings.
That's right, right? How does it go? And the church of Christ was born, and the Spirit lit the flame.
Yeah.
Now this gospel truth of old shall not kneel, shall not faint. For in his blood and in his name, in his freedom I am free. For the love of Jesus Christ has resurrected me, right? And that this has been inaugurated here, and it permeates forward. This is why the author of Hebrews will later admonish folks like, hold on, don't give up hope. Live by faith, looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and for the joy set before him. He has inaugurated something that will come to fulfillment when he returns for those who are eagerly waiting. In verse 28, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting for him. He has dealt with sin in his person. He has purified and continues to purify. He's taking over the world. Hold on until he comes. Hold on, because he who promised is faithful. He's inaugurated this new reality, and he's doing this thing for us. He has done this thing for us. He's taking back what the enemy took. Hold on.